maha, haere, haere, haere. Nā tangata whenua o tēnei rohi, tēnā koutou. Tātou nā kānohi e hui mai ana, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora koutou katoa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, talofa lava, and welcome to everyone who has joined us this afternoon for this incredibly important milestone. When New Zealand faced the most horrific of terrorist attacks on March 15, 2019, as a nation, we resolved to be better. That while our Muslim community faced that day the act of one individual, there was much that we collectively needed to change. And so we committed to do all we could to make New Zealand a safer, more diverse, and a more inclusive place. 10 days after the attack, the Royal Commission of Inquiry began a lengthy process and gave us 44 recommendations that we have agreed in principle to all of. Many have been delivered, and we are the better for them. Gun reform, new counter-terrorism law to make planning a terrorist attack a criminal offence, Ministry for Ethnic Communities to give voice where it lacked, to name just a few. But it's recommendation 14 for which we are here today. To establish a program to fund independent New Zealand-specific research on the causes of and measures to prevent violent extremism and terrorism. But we've taken that recommendation a bit further. We wanted a permanent presence, a repository of sorts to ensure the work is embedded in our thinking, our conversation, and our policy making. And today we launch a National Centre of Research Excellence for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism, He Whenua Tarikura. And so to the people I want to acknowledge today, the two directors of the Centre, for which I can formally announce, and which I'm sure is well known to those in the room, particularly the two directors. If this is a surprise, we have a problem. Professors Joanna Kidman and Paul Spoonley. Professor Kidman, I know your work spans Indigenous sociology, Māori youth higher education, decolonisation studies and comparative education. I know how glad we are to have you on board. Professor Spoonley, many of us in this room have read your work on social cohesion and diversity, racism, the far right, white supremacism and anti-Semitism. And while both professors have a wealth of knowledge and experience, we do not expect you to take this work forward on your own. Together, you will lead the charge to bring together research organisations, civil society and government, hosting, for instance, an annual hui on countering terrorism and violent extremism, to help us to understand the New Zealand context with research on pathways to radicalisation, factors that drive violent extremism and what can reduce it, the role of language, disinformation, and social media networks to influence individuals and communities, gender differences and radicalisation, and utilising online platforms for prevention and disengagement opportunities. Grants and scholarships will fund the way as the government increased its investment in the Centre in Budget 2022, and I acknowledge Minister Little in the room for his advocacy around the work as we follow on from the Royal Commission. I understand that several of our scholarship recipients are here today. It has been wonderful to read about the work you're about to embark upon. It includes women's experiences of faith-based extremist narratives in everyday life, understanding key causes and drivers of violent extremism in New Zealand, the role of disinformation and conspiracy theories playing contemporary pathways to radicalisation, and insight on how the securitisation of communities can be avoided and open engagement and partnership achieved. Can I ask those who may be our scholarship recipients to give out a bit of a wave? At a personal level, can I thank you for the work that you're about to embark on? I cannot tell you how important it is to New Zealand, but also to the world right now. And we agree. And as we continue this work and look to show From Aotearoa New Zealand leadership to what is a global challenge, it's helpful to know that New Zealand is not alone in addressing the challenges of violent extremism. We're not alone. But that doesn't mean that everyone else's answers are right for us. And that is why it's so important that we have a uniquely Aotearoa lens to the work that you are embarking upon. I've recently returned from the United States where I had several, in fact, half of me thinks I'm still there. I've had several opportunities to speak to our experience and the work we're doing collaboratively, including on the Christchurch call. And Anjum, who I believe is in the room, I thank you for your ongoing role on that incredibly important piece of work. It was a direct response to the attack of March 15, an example of how a global community can collectively make a tangible difference, even when there's more to do. I came away with two messages in the front of my mind around that work. Firstly, as I said, there is much more work for us to do, but there is also room for hope. We know what the problems we face are. We just need to work together to solve them. And that's where our scholars come in today. Our National Centre of Research Excellence is part of the legacy of March 15, not just to build a more secure nation, but to build one more empowered by knowledge, empathy, understanding and kindness, informed, most importantly, by research, evidence, and a drive to keep one another safe. I believe the work produced by the Centre will help us to be a more resilient, inclusive and safer Aotearoa New Zealand. I thank you for being part of that vision. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Ngā manuhiri, ngā tangata nau mai haere mai ki te kaupapa o te rā, he whenua taurikura, the National Centre of Research Excellence for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure and an honour to be here at the launch of this very important initiative at this very important time. Acknowledge Te Piremia, Prime Minister, and obviously tautoko everything the Prime Minister has said, because that's what responsible ministers do. But can I acknowledge the co-directors of the Centre, Distinguished Professor Paul Spoonley and Professor Jacinda Kidman, and the Prime Minister has outlined their academic credentials, but I could not think of a combination of two academics who are best placed to lead this, or to establish actually this research centre. So thank you both for stepping into that very important role. As I understand it, the nature of this research centre is going to be that it'll sort of rotate through various tertiary institutions over time, and we would expect over time, of course, others will have the opportunity to assist and direct it. Can I also acknowledge the scholarship recipients, and again, like the Prime Minister, looking through the proposals that you've put up, it is a fantastic array of research that we can see coming forward. I want to acknowledge that one of the challenges that I think the Royal Commission of Inquiry set down for us, when you look at the underpinning theme of their report, and no doubt the way they conducted their inquiry, was to proceed on the basis that violent extremism, like racism, which we're well familiar with, those things that are the progenitor of terrorism and terrorist acts, start in our communities, start with people. And we haven't necessarily spent a lot of time exploring what it is, what are the threads and the strains that exist in our communities, what are the things that exist in our history that might drive people to think in certain ways, to adopt certain values that are certainly contrary to the sorts of social values that most of us have been brought up with. And what is it that would cause the sort of events that we see around the world and now tragically have seen here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so the research work that our scholars are going to be doing, them and the generations that will follow, is absolutely critical to us to understand as we begin to think about what do we do to achieve this vision of he whenua taurikura, a land at peace. That, of course, was the vision of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and 182 years on, we're still on that journey. It took some very unfortunate and tragic paths on that as well. But we have a better understanding now, and we have a better understanding of humanity. We think back to the world after the last major conflagration that involved the whole world, World War II. And what came out of that was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Very important values. They are about, for each of us around the world, our place in the world, the nation that we are part of, the communities that we're part of, and our rights and freedoms. And the values that underpin that document are as essential and important today as they were at that time, as the world reflected on that great tragedy. But the world has changed. The way we communicate, the way we get information, that has all changed. And we have a lot more sort of, you might say, unmoderated, unfiltered information that comes at us through various channels. That's not a criticism of that development, it's life, it's the reality, it's the way that it is. But it does change the way communities operate, the way that people operate, where they get their information from. And one of the challenges that we have. When I look at the work that the Royal Commission our colleague, the Honourable Priyanka Radhakrishnan, is leading, as she also takes responsibility for the new Ministry for Ethnic Communities. That is long-term work, and that is about working with minority communities to make sure that their place and their time in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is a time when they can say, of this land, this is their land. And when we think about the work on countering terrorism and violent extremism, we've talked a bit about that. And then there's the machinery stuff, the intelligence and security agencies, and how do we best ensure that they work in a context that is doing the job they are required to do, which is keeping us safe from emerging threats and so on as well. Plenty of work to do as we of the Royal Commission. One of the critical elements intelligence. What this centre has the potential to do is going to be absolutely fundamental. So to those in the inaugural phases, good luck. You have our best wishes and our high expectations, and I know you'll meet those. To the scholars, good luck for your studies, and I look forward very much to the product of your labours and your intellectual work. And to all of us, I know we will wish this centre great success in the many years ahead, because it is so vital to where we are going and what we need to do as a nation. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you, Prime Minister and Minister. I'm now delighted to invite the co-directors to say a few words. So I'll start with Professor Kidman and then Professor Spoonley.
Tēnei te mihi, tēnei te mihi, tēnei te mihi. Kia koutou ngā kaitiaki o tēnei whenua, he mihi nui ngā iwi o te motu, ngā tangata o te opoko o te ika Māui. He mihi aroha, he mihi maiuha, tēnei kia koutou katoa. Thank you, Prime Minister and Minister Little. Thank you for being here today and for making this possible. I'd also like to acknowledge those who are here representing your communities and those from government agencies. To the scholarship students who have joined us, I had some time with them this morning, they're incredible. To my colleagues and friends from the university, DPMC, particularly Andy George and Julia MacDonald, my co-director, distinguished Professor Paul Spoonley, great to be working with him, and of course Vincent O'Malley, who is always my greatest support. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, kia ora. This is a really exciting initiative, but importantly, it's an initiative that delivers a message of hope. And that's because we live in uncertain times. And in many ways, the future is both more predictable and less predictable than perhaps it's ever been. So we need to find ways of living in uncertain times. As a nation, we witnessed the attack on the mosques in Christchurch in 2019. And we grieved for those who lost their lives and their loved ones. And in our own communities, we've seen the rise of groups that carry messages of hate and destruction. So these are troubled times. And that's where He Whenua Taurikura will be making its contribution. We are going to produce an evidence base that will help us to understand and make sense of those hairline fractures in our communities that at times have splintered and hatred. He Whenua Taurikura will bring together research space about how we might prevent these terrible events from happening again. So to Māori communities, ethnic groups, members of the rainbow community, those belonging to faith and religious groups, we acknowledge you and we will work with you to secure a safer future. The researchers and scholars who join us in this endeavour are going to be exploring some very dark places in the nation's psyche, but they will do that with integrity, fairness and courage. It's a huge task. There are no easy answers, but this is our message in a bottle moment. This is our message to the future, to let those who come after us know that we worked together for a society. I'm really looking forward to beginning that journey. Kia ora.
Te little, tēnā korua, ina mana na waka ina reo o nā mana whenua, tēnā koutou, e rangati kia ora mai anō, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa. Talofa lava, salam alaikum, shalom. Here is the logo for the centre and was designed by Ariki Collective and represents the overcoming of challenges and the striving to create a safe place for whānau to come together to speak and to address problems. We have our challenges, and those challenges have escalated in recent months and years. There has already been considerable investment to get to today, and I want to echo Joanna's comments and thank and have articulated their concerns and suggestions. Our task is to continue that work. In the 2021 government document, which outlined the work programme for countering terrorism and violent extremism, the task for He Whenua Taurikura was identified as building a shared and clear evidence-based understanding of the evolving challenge of violent extremism and terrorism and their underlying causes. That is our challenge. That is what we must do. The document goes on to suggest that there are 4 elements: mōhio, or understanding; mahitahi, working together; whakaho taitai, prevention; and takutu, responding. Our immediate task is to add to the mohiu that we have, or the understanding that we have at the moment, of violent extremism. But that understanding and an appropriate evidence base cannot be achieved without working with communities, the government and the research sector. So the task is incomplete without how best to respond, or preferably how best to prevent violent extremism. One of our clear messages from He Whenua Tarikura Hui in Christchurch last year was that communities, especially those that were most impacted by vitriol and violence, need to be involved in setting research priorities, in the research itself, and in being given the tools to identify and respond to extremism amongst its own members. Our hope is that our expertise and understanding will make a tangible and real-world impact on the safety and well-being of communities of Aotearoa, and especially those targeted by extremism. There is also the threat that Minister Little referred to, which is the threat to our democratic systems and values. By its very definition, violent extremism seeks to undermine the very nature of liberal democracy. We have more than enough evidence to demonstrate at this point that there are those in this country who subscribe to political subcultures and ideologies that are deeply, deeply toxic. Further, and I'm sure that no one in this room needs to be convinced, that the rise of online vitriol and conspiracies represents a significant threat to our political process and the safety of our communities. Kia mahi tahi tātou, let's work together to achieve the challenges that have been identified for He Whenua Tarikura, and to ensure that this country is one that is truly at peace. Kia ora tātou katoa.
Tēnā tātou,